The luxury car dealership gleamed under the California sun like a row of diamonds on display. Gleaming Teslas, glistening Porsches, and that one all-black Range Rover parked out front, the kind of car you only see in movies or rap videos. Inside, the air was crisp with the scent of leather and fresh polish. But for Hailey and Sophie Carter, the welcome was anything but warm. They stepped through the glass doors, their sneakers squeaking slightly on the marble tile floor. Hailey, 17, wore a faded NASA hoodie and jeans with a rip in the knee. Sophie, just 15, had her hair in a messy ponytail and a notebook clutched tight against her chest. They didn't look like millionaires, but they didn't care. They weren't here to impress anyone. They were here on a mission. "Do you think this is the right place?" Sophie whispered, glancing nervously at the rows of glimmering vehicles. "It has to be," Hailey replied. "You saw the ad. They've got the '67 Mustang in the back. Just act normal." They approached the front desk, where a young woman with a tight bun and red lipstick looked up, smiled, then looked them up and down. "Can I help you?" she asked, her smile fading quickly. "Yeah," Hailey said, trying to sound confident. "We're here to ask about a car. The '67 Mustang you have listed." The woman blinked. Her eyes flicked over to a sharply dressed salesman leaning against a display counter. He caught her glance, smirked, and walked over. "You girls lost or something?" he asked, arms crossed. His name tag read Derek. Sophie took a deep breath. "We saw your online listing and wanted to ask a few questions." Derek chuckled, clearly amused. "That car's not exactly in your price range, sweetheart." Hailey frowned. "You don't know our price range." He raised an eyebrow. "And you don't look like you have one." The words stung, but Hailey stood her ground. "We just want to look. That's not illegal, is it?" Another employee nearby snorted. The receptionist typed something aimlessly, pretending not to listen. The vibe shifted from passive to hostile in a flash. "You can't be hanging around here," Derek said, voice firm. "This isn't a playground, customers only." But Sophie started, but Hailey grabbed her arm. "Come on," Hailey said quietly. "Let's just go." They turned to leave, cheeks burning, heads down. The door clicked shut behind them with a cold finality. Sophie's hands shook as she clutched her notebook tighter. "I didn't think they'd treat us like that," she said, her voice cracking. Hailey swallowed hard, her jaw clenched. "I did." They stood outside on the sidewalk, the cars behind the glass still gleaming like promises they weren't allowed to touch. A few feet away, Derek watched them through the window, arms still crossed. He smirked. They were gone. But what Derek didn't know, what no one at that dealership knew, was who those girls were and what was coming tomorrow. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The ride home was mostly silent. Hailey kept her eyes on the road, fingers gripping the steering wheel of their old Subaru, the engine humming like it had a cold. Sophie sat beside her, tracing invisible patterns on the window, still thinking about Derek's smirk. The silence wasn't awkward. It was heavy, thick with unspoken frustration and the kind of disappointment that settles in your stomach like a stone. "They didn't even ask our names," Sophie finally muttered. "They didn't need to," Hailey said, her tone flat. "They saw our clothes, our car. That was enough." The Subaru pulled into the gravel driveway of a modest two-story house tucked in the hills above Los Angeles. It wasn't run down, but it wasn't flashy either. From the outside, it looked like any other house in the neighborhood. Inside, though, lived one of the most private and underestimated men in California, David Carter, Hailey and Sophie's father. A quiet man with kind eyes, worn jeans, and hands that still bore the calluses of a lifetime of building things. To the girls, he was just Dad. To the world, he was barely on the radar. And that's exactly how he liked it. Inside the house, the kitchen smelled like garlic and butter, David's signature pasta sauce. He looked up from the stove as the girls walked in. "Hey, kiddo," he said, flipping off the burner. "You guys back already?" Hailey shrugged. "Yeah, wasn't a great trip." Sophie dropped her notebook on the kitchen counter with a little too much force. David raised an eyebrow. "Something happen?" There was a pause. Hailey and Sophie exchanged glances. For a second, it seemed like they might spill it all, but then Hailey just said, "Just some rude salespeople, nothing new." David turned back to the pot, but something in his posture shifted, the subtle way his shoulders stiffened, the twitch of his jaw. He didn't press, though, just stirred the sauce a little harder than necessary. They sat down to eat, the girls, pushing pasta around their plates, appetite gone. Sophie couldn't hold it in any longer. They made fun of us, said we didn't look like we could afford anything, told us to leave. David stopped mid-bite. His eyes met Sophie's, calm but unreadable. "What dealership?" he asked. "Grant Automotive," Hailey answered. "The one on Sunset. They had that Mustang we wanted to surprise you with." There was a flicker in David's eyes, just for a moment. Then he nodded slowly, dabbed his mouth with a napkin, and stood up. "I see," he said simply, and that was it. He didn't yell, didn't ask for names, just started cleaning the dishes like nothing had happened. But inside, something shifted, something old and deep. David Carter hadn't always lived in the shadows. Once, long ago, he'd been the face of a booming tech company, a genius inventor with a disruptive vision. He'd sold it all before his girls were even in middle school, walked away from the public eye with billions in his bank account and a promise to never let the money change them. But tonight, something about the way Sophie's voice cracked, about how Hailey wouldn't even look up from her plate, it stirred something in him. Not anger, purpose. Upstairs in their shared room, Sophie flopped onto her bed. Maybe they were right. We didn't belong there. Hailey looked over from her laptop. No, they were just wrong, that's different. But it felt real, Sophie whispered. Like we were invisible. Hailey didn't have an answer for that. Not tonight, but tomorrow. Tomorrow everything would change. The next morning was like any other. Sunlight filtered in through the kitchen blinds. The scent of coffee filled the air. David stood at the counter, calm as ever, scrolling through something on his phone. Hailey shuffled in wearing an oversized hoodie, hair a mess. Sophie followed, yawning, still half asleep. "You girls sleep okay?" David asked without looking up. "Mm-hmm," Sophie mumbled. Hailey raised an eyebrow. "You're up early." David looked up and smiled, just catching up on a few things. He didn't mention the dealership, not a word. Just poured coffee into his favorite old mug, the one with "Come One Dad" barely legible through the chips, and took a slow sip. But behind that calm exterior, David was already 10 steps ahead. He stepped into his study later that morning, a room the girls rarely entered. It was minimalist, a large oak desk, a wall of books, a sleek desktop setup with 3 monitors, and a safe hidden behind a painting of a mountain lake. Most people assumed David was retired, that he'd made some smart real estate investments and lived off the interest. That was exactly how he wanted it. What they didn't know? David Carter had founded Cortex Systems, a groundbreaking AI firm that powered security infrastructure for everything from airports to Fortune 100 companies. 10 years ago, he sold it for $1.6 billion and quietly walked away. And now, after years of silence, the system he once built was still paying dividends through private equity funds, joint ventures, and a handful of startups he backed from the shadows. His name was rarely attached. He preferred it that way, but today he was making an exception. He opened an encrypted file labeled Ironwood Trust, one of his private holding firms. In seconds, he located the asset information for Grant Automotive. He didn't own the dealership, but he owned the land it sat on. The property lease had been negotiated through a real estate group that reported up through Ironwood. It would take one call, one signature, one notice of lease termination if he wanted to. But David wasn't here to crush anyone. That wasn't the point. He wanted to send a message, one they'd never forget. That afternoon, he made a single phone call, not to his assistant, not to a lawyer. He didn't need middlemen. David called the dealership himself. "Hi, this is Derek at Grant Automotive," the familiar voice answered, chipper and professional. David smiled. "Derek, this is Mr. Carter. I'd like to come by this afternoon to take a look at your inventory." "Oh, sure," Derek replied, sounding slightly confused. "Anything in particular you're looking for?" "I'm interested in the 1967 Mustang Fastback you've got in your backlot," David said, voice calm. "I saw it listed. Is it still available?" There was a pause. Derek cleared his throat. Yes, sir, it is. That car's a beauty. David's smile didn't reach his eyes. Good. I'll be there at 3. Back at the house, Sophie watched a video on her phone while Hailey worked on an old engine blueprint for a school project. Neither of them knew their dad was about to turn the car world upside down. Neither of them knew that at 3 p.m., their quiet, unassuming father would walk into the same dealership that had kicked them out, with the full weight of a billion-dollar empire behind him. At 2:55 p.m., a modest grey SUV pulled into the lot at Grant Automotive. No chauffeur, no exotic wheels, just a dusty 2014 Lexus RX, the kind you'd see parked outside any grocery store. No one batted an eye as it rolled into a visitor spot near the front door. Inside the dealership, Derek leaned against the front counter, chatting with a co-worker. The showroom was quiet, midday slow. He didn't even look up when the bell on the door jingled. David Carter stepped in. He wore his usual jeans, a navy polo, and a black windbreaker. No Rolex, no shiny shoes, no visible signs of wealth. Just calm, confident energy, the kind that doesn't ask for respect but naturally commands it. He walked with purpose. "Can I help you?" The receptionist asked, already reaching for her customer smile. "I'm here to see the '67 Mustang," David said, voice even, eyes locked on hers. Derek looked over and frowned slightly. The man didn't look like much. Still, something about the way he spoke made Derek walk over. "You're Mr. Carter?" Derek asked, checking his phone. "That's right." Derek gave a tight smile. "Follow me." They walked through the side door and into the back lot. The Mustang sat there like a relic. Matte black chrome trim, a beast of a car with attitude in every curve. David paused, taking it in. He didn't say anything, just walked around it slowly, taking stock of every detail. Derek watched him, arms crossed. Classic American muscle. Needs a little work, but it's all original. Engine still roars. We've had a few lookers, but it's not exactly priced for browsers, if you catch my drift. David ran his fingers across the hood, then turned. "I'll take it." Derek blinked. "You want to negotiate or—" "No, I'll take it. Full price. Right now." Derek gave a nervous chuckle. "Okay, I mean, we'd need a credit check and some ID." David reached into his jacket and pulled out a black Centurion Amex. The metal card hit the clipboard with a quiet clink. Derek's mouth opened slightly. He knew what that card meant. You don't just get a Centurion card. You're invited. It's not about credit. It's about status. "Do you need to see?" "ID?" David asked, calm as ever. No, sir," Derek stammered. "That's not necessary." Back inside, the staff watched David with fresh eyes. Someone had clearly texted the group chat. The energy had shifted fast. The manager, Rick Saunders, a guy in his late 40s with slicked-back hair and a blazer 2 sizes too tight, hurried over. "Mr. Carter, welcome. We had no idea you were coming in today," he said, overly enthusiastic. "I hope you're being taken care of." David looked him dead in the eye. "You kicked my daughters out yesterday." Rick froze. "I'm sorry, what?" "Hailey and Sophie. 2 teenage girls. You told them they didn't look like they could afford to be here." Rick glanced at Derek, who suddenly found the tile floor fascinating. David stepped forward, voice low but razor sharp. "You judged them because of how they looked. Because they didn't fit your idea of a customer. That Mustang, it was a gift for me. They saved up, researched it, and came here with excitement in their hearts. And you turned them away." Rick's face drained of color. I had no idea." "No," David interrupted. "You didn't, because you weren't looking, and that's the problem." He pulled a slim leather folder from his jacket and handed it to Rick. "These are papers from Ironwood Trust. That's the real estate firm that owns this land. You lease from us." Rick's hands trembled slightly as he opened the folder and scanned the documents. "I'm not canceling the lease," David said, "but I am buying this dealership." Silence. Dead. Cold. Silence. David looked around the room, catching the eyes of every person watching. "Starting tomorrow, things will change here. Attitudes, standards, leadership." He turned back to Rick. "You can stay on if you'd like, but you won't be in charge." Rick swallowed hard. Who's taking over?" David walked to the front door, paused, smiled. "My daughters." And with that, he stepped out. the door swinging shut behind him. Inside, no one moved. Derek looked like he was about to be sick. Outside, David Carter got into his Lexus and drove off, leaving behind the first blow in a quiet storm that was just beginning. The news didn't spread. It exploded. By the time the sun dipped behind the Hollywood Hills that night, whispers were already flying through group chats, neighborhood Facebook groups, and even the Nextdoor app. Some rich guy just bought out Grant Automotive because they disrespected his kids. True story. His daughters came in yesterday and got kicked out. Dude walked in today, dropped a black Amex, and bought the whole place. No way that's real. Swear. My cousin works there. Said the staff's in meltdown mode. The guy's apparently worth billions. By morning, it wasn't just rumor. It was legend. At Oak Ridge High, Hailey and Sophie walked through the front gates like any other day. But this time, it felt different. Heads turned. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. People stared. Sophie slowed her step. Okay, are we being punked right now? Hailey glanced around. Feels like it. Then, from behind them, "Yo, Carter sisters," a voice rang out. They turned to see Miles, Hailey's lab partner, and occasional lunch table buddy. "You guys really get kicked out of a dealership and then your dad buys it?" he asked, eyes wide. Sophie blinked. "Wait, how do you know about that?" "Everyone knows," he said, waving his phone. "It's all over TikTok. Some employee at the dealership leaked it. There's even a voice recording of your dad calling out the manager. It's kinda epic." Hailey's face flushed. "That's a lot." No, this is power move legend status," Miles said, grinning. "People are calling him the silent CEO. Your dad's basically Batman." Sophie laughed despite herself. "The billionaire vigilante of car dealerships." Then came the parade. People who had never spoken to them before were suddenly overly friendly. Hand waves, compliments, questions like, "What's your dad investing in next?" or "Can you help me buy a car?" Hailey felt the shift. Not the good kind either. This wasn't respect. It was opportunism, wrapped in fake smiles. Lunchtime was worse. Their usual quiet corner near the back of the cafeteria was suddenly full. Everyone wanted a seat near the Carter sisters. Sophie looked overwhelmed. Hailey could feel her patience draining with every, "So what's it like being rich?" and, "Are you guys getting chauffeurs now?" "I think I'm gonna eat outside." Sophie whispered. Hailey nodded. "I'll come with." They grabbed their trays and escaped to the senior lawn, sitting under their favorite tree near the art building. The breeze was soft. For a moment it felt like the world stopped spinning so loudly. Sophie poked at her sandwich. "I didn't want this. I know. I just wanted to do something cool for Dad." "You did," Hailey said softly. "We both did." They sat in silence for a while, then Sophie asked, "Is this what it's always going to be like now?" Hailey didn't answer right away. She was thinking about how people treated them before, how they were overlooked, underestimated, dismissed. Now it was all attention, but none of it real. "No," she finally said. "It won't always be like this." Sophie looked at her. "How do you know?" "Because we're not just going to be someone's daughters anymore." Hailey smiled, eyes steady. "We're going to do something, and they're all going to know us." "For us, not him." Sophie smiled faintly. "That sounds like a plan." Meanwhile, across town, Rick Saunders sat in his now former office with a box of his things and a pink slip in his hand. Derek was nowhere to be found. Rumor had it he quit before the new management arrived. David Carter stood near the windows, watching the lot as mechanics prepped the Mustang for delivery. Beside him stood Elena, his longtime legal advisor and the one person who knew everything about him. "You really want to hand over a business to two teenage girls?" she asked, arms crossed. David smiled. "They're not just any girls. They're my girls." When David said he was handing them the keys to the dealership, Hailey thought he meant figuratively, until he actually handed her a full set of them. "Wait, you're serious?" she asked, staring at the keyring with a small tag that read, "Operations." "Main office?" David nodded, sipping his coffee like he just told her the weather. "You're not just figureheads," he said. "You're in charge, and that means learning everything. From the ground up." Sophie blinked. "Like sales, service, customer disputes, inventory, HR, everything. Do we get, like, a manager to do that stuff for us? Hailey asked, half hopeful. David shook his head. Nope, you become the manager. The next morning, the girls pulled into the dealership lot in the beat-up Subaru. The place looked different now. Not physically, same glass windows, same lot layout, but the energy was new. A few employees watched them from behind the glass, curious. Some skeptical. A couple of them? Just plain annoyed. Inside, Marla, the front desk receptionist who'd watched them get kicked out days ago, raised an eyebrow. Welcome back, she said cautiously. Sophie offered a nervous smile. Yeah, wild, right? Hailey pushed the door to the office open and stopped short. The space was tiny, a shared desk, 2 mismatched chairs, a dry erase board with a bunch of dealership goals scribbled in someone's barely legible handwriting. Not exactly a corner office, Hailey muttered. David stepped in behind them. Good, he said. Now you won't get comfortable. The first task? Shadowing the service department. By 10 a.m., Sophie was elbow-deep in the parts catalogue, with a technician named Luis trying to figure out how to order brake pads for a 22 Escalade. Meanwhile, Hailey was out in the bay with a mechanic named Rhea, watching her do a full inspection on a vintage Alfa Romeo. So, you're the boss now? Rhea asked, smirking as she wiped her hands on a towel. I guess, Hailey replied, squinting at the engine. But right now I'm mostly just the girl who can't tell a carburetor from a catalytic converter. Rhea chuckled. At least you're honest. We've had worse. Hailey cracked a small smile. So how do I actually earn your respect? Rhea looked her dead in the eye. Show up, work hard, and don't act like you're better than the people who've been here grinding every day. Fair enough. Sophie, meanwhile, was struggling. Luis had given her a service invoice and told her to find the part number and get it into the system. 20 minutes later, she was still staring at the screen, overwhelmed. I'm trying, she muttered. Luis looked over her shoulder. You're doing fine. No one gets it on day one. You should have seen Derek. Guy didn't know the difference between a socket wrench and a flathead. Sophie looked up. You didn't like him either? Luis shrugged. He liked himself enough for all of us. Wasn't a bad salesman, just never listened. That stuck with her. At lunch, the sisters regrouped in the office, both covered in a light layer of dust, sweat, and paperwork confusion. So, Hailey said, plopping down. Thoughts? I'm overwhelmed, Sophie admitted. But weirdly, I kind of like it. Same, Hailey said, pulling her hair into a bun. I mean, it's a mess, but it's our mess. David walked in, holding 2 thick binders. He set them down with a thud. What's that? Hailey asked. Dealership policies and financials, he said. You'll need to go through them, tonight. Sophie groaned. Seriously? David grinned. Rule 1 of being the boss. The work doesn't end when you go home. That night, while their classmates were watching Netflix or scrolling TikTok, the Carter sisters sat on their bedroom floor, papers and sticky notes everywhere, learning the difference between a gross profit margin and a floor plan financing agreement. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't easy, but it was real. And for the first time in a long time, Hailey and Sophie didn't just feel like kids anymore. They felt like something else entirely, capable by the 3rd day. The new car smell of excitement had worn off. Reality hit harder than a stripped lug nut. At 8:45 a.m., Hailey walked into the service bay only to be met by silence. Not the productive kind. The everyone stopped talking when you walked in kind. The mechanics barely acknowledged her. Rhea gave a half smile. Luis nodded politely, but Mike, the oldest tech on the team, bearded, gruff, old-school grease-under-the-fingernails type, just kept working on a Dodge Ram without saying a word. Hailey stepped closer. Hey, Mike, just checking on the schedule for the 10 a.m. oil change. Customer called yesterday, said, you don't need to check on anything, he said, cutting her off. Hailey blinked. Excuse me? He stood up, wiped his hands on a rag, and turned to face her full on. You're what, 17? 18? Been here less than a week, haven't picked up a wrench, and now you're running the shop? I'm here to learn, he snorted. Learning's fine. Pretending you're my boss, that's not. Hailey felt her stomach twist, but her voice stayed steady. I'm not pretending, my dad— Yeah, your dad, Mike snapped. Bought his daughters a business like it's a damn pony. The room went dead quiet. Hailey's face burned. She wasn't sure if it was embarrassment or anger, or both. Before she could reply, Rhea stepped in. She's not just watching from the office, Mike. She's in here every day. Asking questions, getting dirty. You didn't see Derek doing that. Mike shook his head. Derek didn't have to. He had experience. These girls are here 'cause Daddy's rich. Hailey opened her mouth, then closed it. She wasn't going to win this fight today. Not with words, but she would earn her place. Meanwhile, Sophie was up front dealing with a different kind of headache, a very loud, very angry customer. I brought my car in for a tire rotation, and now there's a rattle. In the back, the woman snapped. Mid-40s, yoga pants, Starbucks cup, and the fury of someone who thought Yelp reviews were a form of war. I totally understand, Sophie said, hands calm, voice soft. We can take a look. I already brought it back once, the woman cut her off. And your tech told me it was normal. It's not. I've driven this car for 3 years. I know what normal is. Sophie's fingers fumbled over the keyboard. She found the appointment notes, flagged the service record, and pulled it up on screen. Luis walked by and subtly gave her a nod. Check the rear sway bar bracket, he mouthed. Sophie turned back to the woman. I'll personally have our technician inspect the rear suspension and make sure the sway bar bracket isn't loose. That could be causing the sound. The woman paused. It wasn't a miracle, but it was enough to ease the fire a little. Fine, she said, just fix it. When the woman finally left, Sophie exhaled so hard she nearly deflated. Luis gave her a thumbs up. Nicely done, boss. That night back at home, the girls sat in the kitchen with open laptops and open stress. Hailey stirred her tea, frowning. So I got called a spoiled rich girl by a guy who probably has more oil in his veins than blood. Sophie raised an eyebrow. Customer screamed at me. Told me I didn't know anything, which is fair. I mean, I kinda don't. They looked at each other, then laughed, because somehow it felt better to say it out loud. David walked in, paused. At the doorway, you okay? We survived, Hailey said. Barely. David nodded, thoughtful. You know what the first 6 months of running Cortex looked like for me? He asked. Sophie smirked. Everyone loved you and threw money. At your feet? David chuckled. I lost 2 partners, got sued twice, and cried in a parking lot in the rain after a pitch meeting. The girls blinked. You cried? Hailey asked. Hard, David said. But the difference between failure and growth is that I kept showing up. He poured himself some coffee, sat down. And you two are already miles ahead of where I was. Because you're not pretending you know everything. You're learning. You're showing up. Hailey smiled slowly. Even when the techs hate us and the customers scream? Especially then. The next morning, Hailey showed up early. She didn't say anything to Mike. She just grabbed a pair of gloves and asked Rhea to teach her how to drain oil on a Toyota Camry. Mike watched from across the bay, didn't say a word. But maybe, just maybe, his glare wasn't as sharp as the day before. The rumble of the engine echoed through the service bay like thunder off canyon walls. The 1967 Mustang Fastback, rebuilt, polished, and purring like a lion after a long nap, sat gleaming in the sun. Deep graphite black with blood-red racing stripes and chrome trim that caught every ray of light. The thing didn't just look powerful, it felt like it had a soul. Sophie stood back, arms crossed, grinning from ear to ear. Hailey walked around, it slowly, her fingers trailing the curve of the hood. Okay, yeah, she said. That's so much cooler than a pony. David chuckled behind them. I wanted to surprise you both with this before everything happened. It was supposed to be a thank you for how hard you've worked the past year, school-home life. But after what happened at the dealership, well, now it means more. Sophie's eyes shimmered, but she held it together. We were just trying to do something nice for you. You did, David said. More than you know. The plan was to drive it home together. Hailey behind the wheel, Sophie riding shotgun, David following behind in the Lexus. But just before they pulled out, Luis jogged up, holding something. Hey, you forgot this, he said, handing Hailey a thick manila envelope. Paperwork, ownership, title, plates, all that. Hailey opened it and paused. There, tucked between the documents, was an old photo. A Polaroid, slightly faded. It showed a younger David, maybe in his 20s. Greasy hands, flannel shirt, standing next to a beat-up Mustang that looked just like this one. In the passenger seat, a girl, long red hair, wild smile, leaning halfway out the window with sunglasses too big for her face. Sophie leaned over. "Is that Mom?" David didn't answer right away. "Yeah," he said softly. "That was our first car. We fixed it up together, spent an entire summer rebuilding it with nothing but borrowed tools, busted knuckles, and a whole lot of trial and error." Hailey blinked. "This is that car?" "No," David said. "That one got totaled. But this—" He nodded at the fastback. "This was the same year, same make, same model. I searched for years to find one in this condition, and when I did, I knew exactly who it was meant for." The sisters were quiet. It wasn't just a gift. It was a memory, a bridge, a little piece of their mom brought back to life on 4 wheels. The drive home was perfect. Hailey eased the Mustang onto the main road, careful but confident. The engine growled as she shifted, the wind ripping through the open windows. Sophie laughed in the passenger seat, her hair flying everywhere. They didn't need music. The car was the soundtrack. At every stoplight, people stared. Phones came. Out. Someone shouted, "Hey, is that thing for sale?" Hailey grinned. Not a chance. Back at home, they parked it in the driveway like it was a crown jewel. David stepped out of the Lexus and smiled, hands on his hips. "Did it drive like you imagined?" "Better," Hailey said. Sophie nodded. "It felt like Mom was there." David looked at them for a long moment, his usual quiet self. "She would have been proud of you both," he said. "Not just for the dealership, for the way you've stepped up, for not backing down." Then he added, with a twinkle in his eye, "Also, she would have absolutely tried to take that Mustang for a spin before either of you." They laughed, the kind that hit your chest and didn't leave a bruise. That night, the Mustang sat under the moonlight like a relic touched by love. But not everything was peaceful. Across town, in a bar near the edge of the city, Rick Saunders sat hunched over a drink. His phone buzzed. He looked at the screen. "An unknown number," he answered. A voice crackled through. "So I heard you got ousted by a couple of teenagers. Must have stung." Rick clenched his jaw. "What do you want?" "I want to talk. Let's just say I've got a reason to dislike the Carter family, too." Rick leaned back, eyes narrowing. "What if I told you their little empire isn't as bulletproof as they think?" The bar was dim, barely lit by a neon Coors Light sign and a flickering TV playing a muted baseball game. Rick Saunders sat in the corner booth, nursing his 3rd bourbon, trying not to look as bitter as he felt. But the truth was, everything about him reeked of it. The woman who slid into the booth across from him didn't waste time on pleasantries. Blonde hair tied back, smart blazer over dark jeans. She looked like someone who walked through high-stakes meetings without breaking stride. Victoria Lang. "I assume you know who I am," she said, dropping a leather folder on the table. Rick gave a small smirk. "Lang Enterprises. You're in. Commercial development. Among other things," she replied. "I like to keep an eye on properties that could be more valuable in different hands." Rick arched a brow. "Let me guess. You're not here for the Mustang." Victoria leaned forward, lowering her voice. "You worked at Grant Automotive for, 10 years. You know the books, the operations, the weak points. I also know David Carter owns the land." "Not forever," Victoria said smoothly. "He holds a majority stake through Ironwood Trust, but one of the minority partners, let's just say they've been looking to sell." Rick blinked. "If I can acquire those shares," she continued, "and apply the right zoning pressure, Carter could be forced to relocate or sell outright. Either way, the dealership becomes unstable. And guess who'd look very appealing as a stabilizing figure to step in?" Rick narrowed his eyes. "You want me to help you take down Carter Automotive?" Victoria smiled like a cat who'd just spotted a bird with a broken wing. "No, I want you to help me take it back. You ran that place. You know the pulse. The people, the holes in the system. I just need a crack, something to leverage." Rick hesitated. He hated David Carter. That part was easy, but something in Victoria's tone made him pause. This wasn't about personal revenge. This was business cold calculated and very, very dangerous. Back at the dealership, things were finally beginning to click. Hailey had taken over parts, ordering, and vendor coordination. Turns out her Type A personality was perfect for managing back-end chaos. She even made Luis laugh twice that day. A record. Sophie, meanwhile, had found her rhythm at the front desk. She had a natural way with people, calming irate customers and smoothing out scheduling messes with a smile and a little sass. By the end of the day, they were both exhausted and proud, until a call came in. Sophie answered. "Grant Automotive, this is Sophie." A pause. Her expression changed. "Yes, he used to work here." "I'm sorry. We don't give out employee contact info." Another pause. Her voice tightened. "No, I don't know where he is. And if you're calling about the property, I suggest you speak with our legal—" "Hello?" They hung up. Sophie stared at the receiver like it had just hissed at her. Hailey walked over. "Who was it?" "Didn't say. Just weird." "Asked for Rick, then mentioned the property." Hailey's brow furrowed. Why would anyone call the front desk, asking about property ownership? They looked at each other. Uncertainty. Something was shifting under their feet, and they could feel it. That night, David sat in his office at home going over paperwork. Hailey stepped in holding her laptop. "Dad," she said, "do we own the entire dealership land?" David looked up. "Through Ironwood Trust, yes. Why?" "There was a call today, asking about the property." They hung up when Sophie wouldn't. "Give them information." David's jaw tightened. "Just slightly. Did they leave a name?" "No." He tapped his pen against the desk. "I'll look into it." But his mind was already racing, because he knew the name that hadn't been said. Victoria Lang. And if she was sniffing around his land, it meant trouble wasn't coming. It was already here. The first sign of trouble came at 8:15 a.m. Sophie opened the dealership's front door, the ding of the bell cutting through the silence of the morning. Hailey was already in the service bay, knee-deep in parts lists and tracking down missing inventory. Everything seemed fine, routine, until the phone rang. Sophie glanced at the screen. The number was unfamiliar, but the area code was local. She picked it up. "Grant Automotive, how can I help you?" There was a brief pause, then a voice she didn't recognize. "I'm calling about a delivery discrepancy." Sophie's brow furrowed. "Excuse me. I ordered a set of Michelin tires for a customer's Jeep Cherokee. You guys sent Goodyear instead. Can you explain that?" Sophie's stomach twisted. "Let me check our records. Can I get your order number?" There was a short silence before the voice responded. "Check your inventory. It was supposed to be a Michelin. Instead, you guys sent the wrong brand, and now I'm getting complaints." From the customer. Sophie quickly entered the details into the system, but the numbers didn't line up. She scrolled through the tire orders, her eyes scanning fast. "Wait a second," she muttered. "You're right. The wrong tires were sent." The voice on the other end didn't soften. "I don't want your excuses. I want the right tires now. If I don't get them by noon, you'll be hearing from our lawyers. Understand?" The line clicked dead before she could reply. Sophie stood there for a long moment, staring at the phone, her heart pounding. This wasn't just a customer complaint. It was serious. With all the legal risks involved, this could spell a disaster for the dealership. She turned and bolted into the service bay. Hailey was knee-deep in tire orders when Sophie stormed in. "Hailey, we have a problem." "Wait, what?" Hailey said, looking up from the tablet. "You okay?" "I just got a call from a lawyer. The wrong tires were delivered to a customer. Michelin instead of Goodyear, and now they're threatening legal action unless we fix it." Hailey's eyes narrowed. "That's not good." Sophie slammed the tablet down on the counter. "I've checked the order. It was a mix-up in inventory. But we need to fix it fast." "Okay," Hailey said, voice already businesslike. "Let's call the supplier, get those tires replaced by noon. You handle the customer, I'll get the paperwork sorted." The urgency in her voice pushed Sophie into action. They both knew they couldn't afford any more mistakes. Especially, now, they were already skating on thin ice with the dealership's shaky reputation. By the time Luis came in at 9 a.m., Sophie and Hailey were already deep in damage control. "Everything okay?" Luis asked, pulling on his work gloves. Sophie threw him a quick look. "Not exactly. We've got an order mix-up with a customer and a lawyer breathing down our necks. I need you to help get those tires swapped with the correct ones fast. Luis nodded. Got it, but where's David? Hailey's face stiffened. He's been out the last couple of days. We'll handle it. Luis paused, glancing between the sisters before he walked off to the service bay. The clock ticked on. By 10:30 a.m., the pressure was mounting. Calls kept coming in from customers and vendors, each adding to the chaos. The dealership was starting to feel like it was falling apart at the seams, and no one knew if they could patch it all together before the wheels came off completely. Hailey was at her desk when Mike came over. His usual gruff demeanor softened a little as he placed a hand on the edge of her desk. You need any help? He asked. Hailey looked up, surprised. What do you mean? You're handling this mess with the tires. I can get the guys in the back to help. We've got a solid track record. We'll handle it and get those tires swapped before noon. We don't need a legal mess, especially not now. Hailey hesitated for a moment, weighing her options. Mike wasn't her favorite person in the world, but right now he was offering a lifeline. All right, she said, pulling out a notepad. Get those tires switched and make sure to document everything. We need a paper trail. Mike gave a sharp nod and walked off. At noon, the tires were swapped. The customer's Jeep was back on the lot, looking as good as new, but the air was still thick with tension. Sophie sat in the front office, waiting for the customer to pick up the car. She wanted everything to go perfectly, no more surprises. But when the woman arrived, her face was stormy. She walked straight up to the counter, eyes narrowed. Do I look like an idiot to you? She snapped. Sophie's hands shook for a second. She didn't flinch. Ma'am, we've handled the error, and your car is ready. The right tires are on now. Please take a moment to inspect the vehicle before you make any decisions. The woman's eyes didn't soften, but she walked outside to the Jeep. Minutes passed like hours. Finally, she came. Back in. All right, fine, but if there's another mistake, I'm taking you to court. Got it? Sophie smiled, even though it was more of a grimace. Understood, ma'am. We appreciate your business. The woman walked out, and Sophie let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. By the end of the day, the tire issue was resolved, but the tension lingered. There were still cracks in the foundation, still whispers and worries. And the phone call Sophie had received earlier wasn't the only threat lurking around the corner. Sitting in his office that night, David stared at a series of documents. Victoria Lang's name kept appearing. Her corporate maneuvers were becoming too close for comfort. If she wanted to play, he was ready to fight. But Rick Saunders? Rick was another problem. One he didn't expect would resurface so soon. David picked up his phone, dialing a number he hadn't called in years. It's time, he muttered. The morning after the tire fiasco, the air at the dealership was thick with unease. Even though they'd managed to avoid the worst-case scenario with the lawyer, the damage had already been done. Customers were starting to question whether Grant Automotive could handle the demands of a growing business. Hailey was at the front desk when the phone rang. She picked it up, forcing a smile even though she could already feel the weight of the day settling in. Grant Automotive, how can I help you? Hailey, it's Mike. She paused. What's up? There's a guy here for you, Mike said, his voice unusually serious. Says he's here to see David. Won't take no for an answer. He's got a suit, looks pretty high up. Says his name's James Parker. Hailey's pulse quickened. Parker? What does he want? Don't. No, but you might want to talk to him. I'll be outside if you need backup. Hailey hung up the phone and turned to Sophie, who had been quietly monitoring the sales dashboard from her desk. I'll be right back, Hailey said, walking toward the front door, her mind racing. James. Parker wasn't the type of man you easily forgot. Tall, sharp-suited, and with a gaze that felt like it could strip the skin off you if you weren't careful. He stood just inside the dealership, watching her approach with cold, calculating eyes. Hailey didn't flinch. What's going on? She asked, trying to sound confident, even though she was uneasy. Parker stepped forward, extending a business card that she hesitated before taking. It was sleek, silver lettering on black, his name etched clearly. James Parker, Senior Vice President, Lang Enterprises. Her heart skipped a beat. You've been trying to expand, Parker said, his voice smooth but heavy with underlying threat. trying to grow beyond your father's operation. But here's the thing. There's a better opportunity, one you haven't seen yet. Hailey crossed her arms. We're fine. I don't know what you think you can offer, but we've got everything. Under control. Parker smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Control is a funny thing, Hailey. You think you have it, but in reality you don't. Not when someone else is controlling the cards. And right now, I hold a few that you might find useful. Are you threatening me? Hailey asked, her voice sharp. Not at all, Parker said, his grin widening. I'm offering you a way out, a chance to partner with someone who can give you the resources you need to scale. Lang Enterprises has the capital, the connections, and together we could turn this little dealership into something much bigger. Hailey's gut tightened. This wasn't an offer, it was a warning dressed in silk. I'll think about it, she said, turning on her heel to leave. No need, Parker called after her. I'll give you 48 hours to make a decision, but think carefully. Your family's future could depend on it. Hailey walked back into the office, her mind spinning. This wasn't just about tires or inventory issues anymore. Lang Enterprises was sniffing around like a vulture, and David was the prey. She passed Sophie, who was still glued to her screen. Sophie didn't even look up. I don't think David's going to like this, Hailey muttered, her thoughts still on Parker's words. Sophie's head snapped up. Who was that? James Parker, Senior VP at Lang Enterprises. Hailey dropped into the nearest chair and exhaled sharply. He wants to partner, or more accurately, take over. Sophie's eyes narrowed. Lang Enterprises is the same company that's been eyeing our property. What did he want? He thinks we need him to grow, that we're not equipped to handle things on our own. And honestly, the worst part is, I'm starting to think he might be right. This place has so many cracks showing, and he could fill them faster than we can keep up. Sophie stood up, pacing. We can't let him take over, not like this. I know, Hailey said, her voice tight. But what if we can't handle it ourselves? What if we don't have a choice? Before Sophie could respond, David walked in, his expression unreadable. His eyes flickered between the sisters, then to the empty chair where Parker had just sat. What's going on? He asked, his tone even. Hailey hesitated, but Sophie answered first. James Parker from Lang Enterprises was here. He made us an offer. David's eyebrows lifted. What kind of offer? Partnership, Hailey said reluctantly. He thinks we need outside help to expand, to scale, and honestly, it might be the boost we need. David's gaze shifted to the window, and for a moment he was lost in thought. You didn't accept anything, did you? He asked quietly. No, Hailey replied. We didn't commit to anything, but he's right about one thing. This place needs more than what we've got if we're going to keep going. David took a deep breath, turning back to face them. Listen, to me, he said, his voice steady but firm. Lang Enterprises is a threat. If we let them in, they'll take control. They've got money, power, but they don't have heart. This dealership is built on more than numbers and profit margins. It's built on the people who've worked here. It's built on family. And I will not let anyone tear that apart, especially not for a quick dollar. Hailey and Sophie exchanged looks. They knew their father had a point, but it wasn't just about pride. It was about survival. David continued. We've got 48 hours, but I'll deal with Parker. I won't let him win. That evening, David left the dealership early, his mind made up. He needed to confront Victoria Lang herself. If he couldn't stop this takeover from the inside, he would shut it down before it even started. The following morning, the tension in the dealership was palpable. Sophie and Hailey moved through their tasks like robots, each trying to hold it together while David handled the storm brewing outside their walls. David had left the dealership at the crack of dawn, a dark resolve on his face. The drive to meet Victoria Lang wasn't long, but the weight of the decision pressed down on him with each passing mile. This wasn't just a business deal anymore. It was about control, survival, and a future that no one else but him could shape. Victoria Lang's office was sleek, minimalist, and intimidating in its modern elegance. As soon as David entered the lobby, the cold metallic floors seemed to hum with the force of the empire she was building. A receptionist with sharp features and an icy gaze didn't need to ask his name. She simply nodded toward the elevator. David stepped inside, his heart hammering in his chest. The elevator doors slid open with a soft chime, and there she was, Victoria Lang, perched behind her glass desk, looking every bit the formidable CEO everyone whispered about. Her dark hair was pulled into a tight bun, and her tailored suit screamed authority. She rose slowly, extending a hand. "Mr. Grant," she said, her voice smooth but cold. "Please, have a seat." David shook her hand firmly but said nothing. He didn't need pleasantries. He wasn't here for a friendly chat. "Let's get to the point," David said, sitting down. "What's your game? Why are you trying to buy out my dealership?" Victoria didn't flinch. She didn't seem the least bit bothered by his directness. "I'm not here to buy out your dealership," she said, her voice measured. "I'm here to offer you something that can ensure your business's survival. Partnership. You and I both know that the car industry is evolving, and if you don't evolve with it, you'll be left behind." David leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "We've been running this business for decades. We've weathered every storm. I don't need your help, especially from someone who doesn't care about the people who make this place tick." Victoria's lips curled into a slight smile, though it was far from warm. "You're emotional about this, I get it. This business is your legacy. But legacies are built on more than just sentiment. They're built on smart decisions, David. I've studied your operations. You're at a breaking point. The margins are thinning, the competition is ruthless, and soon people will stop walking through your doors." David's jaw tightened. He knew she was right. They had been struggling, especially with the influx of new car dealerships around town, many of them bigger, flashier, more corporate. But this wasn't the way to fix it. Not by selling out. "We'll figure it out," he snapped, standing up. "We don't need you. I won't hand my family's business over to anyone." Victoria's expression softened slightly, but the coldness never left her eyes. "You don't have a choice, David. Either you partner with me or you'll be forced to sell, and the longer you wait, the more the price will drop. I suggest you think carefully." David turned and walked to the door without another word, his mind racing. This wasn't over. Not yet. But he had just learned something he hadn't expected. Victoria Lang was ruthless, and she wasn't going to stop until she had what she wanted. Back at the dealership, Sophie and Hailey waited anxiously. They'd watched David leave, his expression grim, and now they were left in limbo, wondering what the future would hold. Hailey sat at her desk, fingers tapping nervously on the surface. "What if he's right? What if we do need to accept her offer? We've been bleeding cash for months now." Sophie looked up from her tablet where she'd been scrolling through financial reports. "I don't know, Hailey, but one thing's for sure, we can't let her control everything. It's not just about money. It's about the people here, the ones who've put in years of hard work, and we can't forget that." The door to David's office creaked open, and he walked in, his face hard, his eyes distant. The weight of his meeting with Victoria Lang hung in the air. "David?" Hailey asked softly, standing up. David exhaled, rubbing his temples. "She's not backing down. She gave me 48 hours to decide, but she made one thing crystal clear. We either accept her offer, or we sell." Sophie crossed her arms, her heart sinking. "We can't sell. This dealership is our family's legacy. We've worked our entire lives to build it. No one's taking that away from us." David looked at Sophie, then Hailey. "I know, but sometimes the fight is bigger than just us, and I'm starting to wonder if we can win this fight without outside help." There was a long silence in the room as the three of them looked at each other. The future of Grant Automotive hung in the balance. David knew he couldn't do this alone. He needed to talk to someone who understood what was at stake. He picked up his phone and dialed a number that had been buried in the back of his contacts for years. It was a long shot, but it was the only shot he had left. Meanwhile, at Lang Enterprises, Victoria Lang stood by her desk, staring out the window. Her fingers tapped against the glass, her mind already moving forward with her plans. She didn't need David Grant. She'd already secured the investment and the backing to swallow up his little dealership. It was only a matter of time, and yet something nagged at her. She knew David. She knew the Grant family. They didn't give up easily. That's what made them dangerous. It wasn't just a business. They were a force to be reckoned with. Victoria's phone buzzed. A text message. It was from James Parker. Are you sure you want to push them? I've heard some rumors about David Grant. There's something about him that's unpredictable. Victoria frowned as she read the message. Unpredictable? What does that even mean? But before she could respond, her assistant knocked on the door. Ms. Lang, the assistant said, a note of hesitation in their voice. There's someone here to see you. They say it's urgent. Victoria's eyes narrowed, a cold smile playing on her lips. Send them in. The weight of David's decision hung over the dealership like a dark cloud. He spent the following days in tense meetings, locked in heated discussions with his lawyers, his accountants, and the people who had supported Grant Automotive for years. But despite all the hours spent analyzing every possible option, one fact remained. They were in trouble, and Victoria Lang wasn't going to let up. David had just finished a conference call when his phone buzzed. He didn't recognize the number, but something about it made him answer. Hello? David Grant? The voice on the other end was rough, the kind that came from years of wear and tear. It's Mark Winston. David's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't heard that name in years, Mark Winston. The name echoed in his mind like a ghost. He had once been one of David's mentors, someone who had taught him the ropes of the car, dealership business when David was just starting out. But Mark had vanished from David's life after a series of bad investments and a particularly shady deal that had nearly taken down his own company. Mark, what do you want? David's voice was cautious, trying to hide the mix of suspicion and surprise. I've been hearing about what's going on at Grant Automotive, Mark continued. I know you're facing some tough choices right now, and if you're still looking to fight Victoria Lang, I might have a way to help. David's mind raced. This was the last person he expected to hear from. Mark Winston had always played by his own rules, and most of those rules were, well, not legal. What are you offering? David asked, unable to hide the skepticism in his voice. A way out of your mess, Mark said. I've got some old connections, people who can help with the financial backing you need to go up against Lang, but I'm going to need something in return. David's gut tightened. Mark never helped anyone without expecting something. What kind of price are we talking about? Mark paused. Let's just say I have a few favors from some very influential people. If you're serious about keeping your dealership and taking Lang down, I can make that happen. But I'm going to need your word that when this is all over, you'll owe me. Big. David rubbed his temple, thinking hard. The offer was tempting. He could use Mark's connections to get the money and resources they needed to fight Lang, but the cost of dealing with someone like Mark Winston was always steep. Still, it might be the only way. I'll think about it, David said, hanging up the phone before Mark could say anything more. Back at the dealership, Hailey and Sophie were dealing with their own brand of chaos. News of their supposed financial struggles had somehow leaked to the media, and the phone calls, emails, and messages of concern were flooding in. The dealership's reputation was at stake, and the last thing they needed was for anyone to question their ability to stay afloat. Sophie was on the phone with one of the suppliers, trying to smooth things over when Hailey entered the back office, her expression grim. We've got a bigger problem, Hailey said, dropping a folder onto the desk. Sophie put down the phone and flipped the folder open. Inside was an article from a local news outlet, one with a headline that made Hailey's stomach drop. Grant Automotive faces bankruptcy. As new competitors emerge, is Lang Enterprises the savior? The article detailed everything. The dealership's financial troubles, the competition from larger corporate-owned car dealerships, and, of course, the supposed offer from Lang Enterprises. This isn't good, Sophie said, her voice tight with frustration. How the hell did this get out? Hailey shook her head. It doesn't matter right now. What matters is that the pressure is on. People are going to start thinking we're going under if we don't do something fast. Just then, the door opened, and David walked in. He looked tired, more worn than usual, but his face was set with determination. What's going on? He asked, his voice low. Sophie handed him the article. This just hit the news. Lang Enterprises is practically declaring victory already, and now everyone thinks we're in trouble. David glanced at the article, his eyes flickering with a brief flash of anger before he looked up. It's just another lie to weaken us, he said, his voice firm. But we don't have time to waste on that. I need to make a decision. About what? Hailey asked. David looked at them both, his expression conflicted. I've got an offer. From Mark Winston. Sophie's eyebrows shot up. Mark Winston? The same guy who nearly ruined his own business with bad deals. David nodded. Yeah, but he's got the resources. If we're going to stand a chance against Lang, we need someone with deep pockets, and he's got connections. We take his help and it's a game changer. Hailey and Sophie exchanged worried glances. They both knew the risks. Mark Winston was a wild card, a dangerous one, but the idea of accepting Lang's offer was becoming less appealing by the minute. Sophie spoke first. So what's the catch? You know Mark doesn't do anything without a price. David ran a hand through his hair. I'd owe him, big time. And I'm not sure what he wants in return, but it's going to cost more than just money. It's a favor. One I'm not sure I'm willing to pay. Hailey frowned. So, either we risk losing everything to Lang, or we get in bed with Mark Winston and owe him something we might not be able to repay. Neither option sounds good. David exhaled deeply. I know, but I don't have much time. I need to decide whether to accept Lang's offer or go down this darker path with Mark. The clock is ticking. As the day wore on, the dealership continued to feel the weight of mounting pressure. For David, it wasn't just about saving the business. It was about protecting the legacy of Grant Automotive and everything it stood for. But as the walls closed in, he knew one thing for sure. The decision he made in the next few hours would determine everything. The decision loomed over David like a storm cloud, threatening to break any moment. He spent the night mulling over Mark Winston's offer, what it meant, what it would cost, and whether he could truly live with the consequences. The dealership had been his family's legacy for decades, and now it was at risk of being torn apart. The thought of Victoria Lang owning it sent a cold shiver down his spine. But Winston's offer, as much as it repulsed him, had a certain allure. Deep pockets, old connections. It was tempting, too tempting to ignore. By the time David made his way back to the dealership the next morning, his mind was made up. He knew what he had to do, even if it meant compromising his integrity. In the end, it was about survival. He walked into his office where Sophie and Hailey were already waiting, their faces tight with concern. I made the call, David said, his voice rough. I'm taking Mark's offer. Sophie's eyes widened. You're serious? You're really going to deal with Mark Winston? David nodded. I don't like it either. But if we don't take this chance, we might lose everything to Lang, and that's not something I'm willing to let happen. Hailey clenched her fists. So we're just going to get into bed with someone like Mark. Do you know what he's capable of? This could end very badly. David's shoulders slumped. I know, but we're at a breaking point. The dealership is slipping through our fingers. If we don't make this move, we're done for. Mark Winston had always been a man of few words. The offer he made was clear. He had the financial backing and the connections needed to save Grant Automotive. But in return, David would owe him a favor. The specifics of that favor were vague, but Mark had made it clear that someday David would have to pay. The meeting was set for later that afternoon. David, Sophie, and Hailey sat in the conference room, tension hanging thick in the air as they waited for Mark to arrive. He'll show up, and we'll make the deal, David said, attempting to sound confident. But even he couldn't shake the gnawing feeling in the pit of his stomach. It wasn't long before Mark entered, his presence filling the room with an air of authority. He was dressed in a tailored suit, his face etched with the hard lines of someone who had been in the game for far too long. He barely acknowledged Sophie and Hailey, focusing solely on David as he sat down across from him. David, Mark said, his voice low and gravelly, I trust you've thought about this. I'm not one for games. David nodded, his hands clasped, tightly in front of him. I'm in. Let's make it happen. Mark's lips curled into a thin smile. Good. I'll wire the funds today. You'll see the first round of investment within 24 hours. But remember, David, this isn't charity. There will come a day when you'll need to pay me back. And when that day comes, you'll have to make good on your word. David swallowed hard but nodded. He didn't like it, but he didn't have much choice. The future of Grant Automotive depended on it. That evening, David couldn't sleep. He lay awake in his bed, staring at the ceiling, his mind racing. The deal with Winston was done, but the weight of what it meant kept him awake. He'd made a deal with the devil, and it was a choice he might regret for the rest of his life. The next morning, Sophie and Hailey arrived at the dealership early, the usual excitement of starting the day dampened by the shadow of their father's decision. The news of the investment had already spread like wildfire throughout the team, but instead of relief, it created more uncertainty. "We've got a meeting with the staff this afternoon," Sophie said, her voice tight. "We need to explain what's going on and reassure everyone that we're not selling out to Lang." Hailey bit her lip. "Do you think they'll believe us? I mean Mark Winston? Everyone knows his reputation. How can we convince them that we're not going down a dangerous path?" David stood at the front of the room, his eyes scanning the faces of the team, many of whom had been with Grant Automotive for years. He could see the worry in their eyes, the hesitation. They weren't stupid. They knew what Mark Winston meant. "We'll have to sell it as our only option," David said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "We're not doing this for personal gain. We're doing this to keep the dealership alive, and we're going to work harder than ever to make sure it thrives." The room remained silent for a long moment, the weight of his words sinking in. Finally, one of the longtime employees, Greg, spoke up. "David, I've been here since your dad first opened this place. I've seen you guys go through hell and back, but this Mark Winston? He's not the kind of person we want involved in this business." David's stomach churned, but he stood his ground. "I get it. Trust me, I don't like it either. But we don't have a choice. Lang Enterprises is breathing down our necks, and if we don't act now, we're done for." Greg nodded slowly. "All right, David, I get it. But just remember, this place isn't just a business, it's a family, and we've all got a stake in it. I hope you know what you're doing." David swallowed hard. He did, but he wasn't sure if it was the right choice. Later that afternoon, David sat in his office, staring out the window as he waited for the confirmation of the first round of funds from Mark. His phone buzzed, and a message popped up from Mark Winston. "Dikchu, wire is in. The clock is ticking. You know the deal." David closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the full weight of his decision. There was no going back now. The road ahead was uncertain, and he could only hope that this gamble would pay off. The morning sun had barely risen when David received a call that set his heart racing. It wasn't from Mark Winston, though. No, it was from Victoria Lang, the one person who had been a constant thorn in his side. Her voice on the other end was cool, almost mocking, as if she knew that she had him cornered. "David," Victoria's voice oozed with that same unsettling calm, "I hope you're ready to see what real competition looks like." David clenched his jaw, not wanting to give her the satisfaction of hearing his frustration. "What do you want, Victoria?" "I just wanted to inform you," she continued, "that I've acquired something very interesting. It's going to make your life just a little bit more difficult." David's stomach dropped. He had no idea what she was up to now, but it was never anything good. "Spit it out, Victoria," he snapped, trying to keep his voice steady. "What's your game this time?" "You'll find out soon enough," she replied cryptically, then hung up the phone without another word. David stared at the screen of his phone, trying to decipher what she meant. But there was no time to dwell on it. The dealership was still dealing with the fallout from the deal with Mark Winston. The employees, while loyal, were anxious about the direction the company was headed. David had to reassure them, but he had no answers, just more questions. Meanwhile, in the back office, Hailey and Sophie were trying to pick up the pieces of the broken trust between their father and the team. The staff meeting earlier had gone as well as expected, but the tension was still thick in the air. It wasn't just the financial situation they were facing, it was the fact that they were now involved in a murky deal with Mark Winston, a man none of them fully trusted. "I don't like this, Hailey," Sophie said, her voice barely above a whisper, as they sat in their office going through inventory reports. "Dad's going to owe Winston something, and that something doesn't sit right with me. What if it comes back to bite us?" Hailey nodded in agreement. "I don't trust him either, but what choice did we have? Lang Enterprises was going to take us down anyway. At least this way we have a shot at fighting back." Sophie tapped her fingers nervously on the desk. Yeah, but at what cost? We don't know what Mark's going to ask for in return, and after what he's done to his own company, I'm worried he'll drag us into something we can't escape. Just then, David walked into the room, his face grim. I just got a call from Victoria. Sophie and Hailey looked up, both expressions filled with concern. What did she want? Hailey asked, her voice tense. David sighed. She's got something on us. Something big. I don't know what it is yet, but I've got a bad feeling about it. I think she's making her move. Again. Sophie shook her head in disbelief. She never gives up, does she? David stared at the floor for a moment before looking up. No. And we need to be ready for whatever she's planning. I'm not letting her win. Not this time. As the day wore on, David couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The threat from Victoria Lang loomed over him, and even with Mark Winston's support, the situation felt precarious. He knew he couldn't just sit back and wait for the next move from Lang. He had to strike first, and that meant figuring out what she had on them. But before he could put his plans into motion, he was called into a meeting with his legal team. The news was bad, worse than he had imagined. You're not going to like this, one of his lawyers said as they gathered around the conference table. Victoria Lang has filed a lawsuit against Grant Automotive. She's claiming that we breached several confidentiality agreements with the suppliers, and she's got evidence, proof that we've been undercutting her in deals. David's eyes widened. What evidence? The lawyer pushed a folder across the table. She's managed to get her hands on some of your internal communications, including emails that suggest you were trying to outbid her on several major contracts. She's using this to paint you as a company that's dishonest and unethical. It's a pretty airtight case. David's mind raced. He couldn't afford a lawsuit right now. If Lang won, it would be the final blow to the dealership. They would be forced to settle, and once that happened, they would lose everything. She's playing dirty, David muttered under his breath. But we won't let her get away with this. The lawyer raised an eyebrow. You need to be careful. If this goes public, it could destroy the reputation of Grant Automotive, and Mark Winston's money won't save you. David clenched his fists. I won't let her ruin everything we've worked for. We have to fight back. Later that evening, as the dealership closed for the day, Sophie and Hailey gathered in David's office. They were all feeling the weight of the situation. The lawsuit, the pressure from Winston, and the constant threat from Lang. David, Sophie said, her voice quiet but insistent, what if we find out what Lang has on us? What if there's something we can do before she pulls the trigger? David looked at his daughters. He could see the determination in their eyes, and it reminded him why he was fighting so hard to keep the dealership alive. We need to dig deeper, David said. If we can get ahead of this, we can expose Lang's game and turn the tide in our favor. But we need to move fast. I'll contact my old connections, see if anyone can get us more information. Hailey nodded. We'll help. We've got your back. David smiled, though it was tinged with worry. I know. We'll fight this together. As the team rallied together, little did they know that Victoria Lang had already taken her next step. She had planted a mole inside Grant Automotive, someone on the inside who would ensure that her plans would succeed. The snake in the grass was already slithering, and David would soon find out just how far Lang was willing to go to bring him down. David stood in the quiet of his office, the hum of the fluorescent lights above him providing an eerie background. As he stared at his phone, the last few days had been a blur of meetings, accusations, and half-hearted reassurances to his team, but it was the call he had just received that was shaking him to his core. A whistleblower. Someone from within the dealership had gone to Victoria Lang. His heart sank as the realization settled in. There was a mole. Who could it be? David thought back to the faces of his employees, those he had worked beside for years. He had trusted them. But now, after everything with Lang, it was impossible to know who might be playing both sides. That evening, after a long day of tense negotiations with Winston's team, David called Sophie and Hailey into his office. Sophie, Hailey, I need you both to listen carefully, he began, his voice strained. We've got a serious problem. I've just been told there's a leak in the company. Someone's working for Lang. Sophie froze, her eyes wide. You're saying someone in the dealership is a traitor? David nodded grimly. I'm afraid. So, and whoever it is has been feeding her information. We need to find out who it is before it destroys us. Hailey crossed her arms, her gaze narrowing. But how do we even start? Who would want to do something like that? David leaned back in his chair, the weight of his words hanging heavy in the room. I don't know, but we're going to find out. We've got to go through everything. Who's been acting strange? Who's had access to sensitive information? Who might have been in contact with Lang recently? Sophie frowned. What if it's someone close to us, someone we never saw coming? David looked up at them, his voice hardening. Then we deal with it. But we need to move fast. Lang won't stop until she gets what she wants. And if we don't cut this out now, we'll be done for. The next day, Sophie and Hailey took to the dealership floor, acting on their father's orders. They began to subtly ask questions, trying to gauge who might be slipping under the radar. The dealership was bustling with activity. New cars, repairs, customers coming and going. But there was a sense of unease in the air. Sophie pulled aside Greg, one of the senior mechanics who had been with the company since David's father, started the dealership. Greg, have you noticed anything unusual around here lately? She asked, her tone casual but laced with an undercurrent of suspicion. Greg scratched his head, glancing around before leaning in. You mean besides the tension between David and Lang? Yeah, I've seen a few things. But you're asking the wrong guy. I don't know anything about any leaks. Hailey, who had been listening in from a distance, stepped forward. Do you think it's possible someone could be working with Lang without anyone noticing? Someone right here in the dealership? Greg's eyes darted nervously. Look, I've been here a long time, and I know how things go. But I'd be careful. If I were you, Sophie, not everyone here is as loyal as you think. Sophie raised an eyebrow. What do you mean by that? Greg shifted uncomfortably. I don't know for sure, but you've got some new faces around here, and you're putting a lot of trust in some people you might not know as well as you think. Sophie and Hailey exchanged a look, their suspicions rising. Meanwhile, David was meeting with Mark Winston at the dealership's back office. Despite the deal they had made, Winston had become increasingly unpredictable. David couldn't shake the feeling that Mark was playing both sides, making promises that seemed to be at odds with his actions. I've been thinking about your situation, David, Winston said, sitting across from him with a cold smile. You've got enemies closing in on you from all sides. Lang, the lawsuit. You're going to need more than just money to get out of this. David narrowed his eyes. What exactly are you suggesting? Winston leaned forward, his tone growing darker. You'll need to make some strategic alliances. Get your hands a little dirty. If you want to beat Lang, you're going to have to fight fire with fire. David gritted his teeth, frustration rising. I didn't make a deal with you to get tangled in your schemes, Winston. I'm doing this to save my business. Winston's grin widened. You don't really think you're going to escape Lang that easily, do you? You'll need me to get out of this mess, David, and I can make sure you stay on top. But I'll expect a return on my investment when the time comes. David stood, up abruptly, pushing his chair back. I'm done with this conversation. I've already made my choice. Winston stood as well, unbothered by David's anger. You may think you have a choice, but you don't. Remember, you're in this for the long haul. Don't forget who helped you. Back on the dealership floor, Sophie and Hailey had continued their quiet investigation. They kept an eye on the newer hires, those who seemed overly eager to please, those who weren't as familiar with the dealership's inner workings, but seemed to have an unusual amount of influence in certain situations. One name kept popping up. Ryan, a young sales associate who had been with the company for only a few months, but had quickly gained favor among some of the higher-ups. Sophie and Hailey decided to confront him, subtly cornering him in the break room. After hours. Ryan, Sophie began, keeping her tone casual. Can we talk for a minute? Ryan glanced around nervously, his eyes darting toward the exit. Sure, what's up? We've been hearing some rumors, and we wanted to clear things up. Do you know anything about a leak in the dealership? About someone passing information? To Lang Enterprises, Hailey asked, her gaze fixed on him. Ryan stiffened, his eyes widening for a split second before he regained his composure. What are you talking about? I haven't heard anything. Sophie narrowed her eyes, watching his body language closely. Something wasn't right. You sure about that? Ryan took a step back, now visibly sweating. "Look, I don't know anything about that, I swear." But the way he avoided their gaze was all the confirmation they needed. The mole was closer than they thought, and now they had a name. David's phone buzzed just as Sophie and Hailey were piecing together the puzzle. It was a message from his lawyer. "The evidence from Lang's lawsuit is more damning than we thought. They've got everything." David's heart pounded in his chest. As if things weren't complicated enough, now they had to deal with an insider, working for Lang, and the stakes were higher than ever. The walls of David's office felt as though they were closing in around him. His mind raced, filled with the weight of everything that was happening. Victoria Lang's relentless pursuit, Mark Winston's manipulations, and now the discovery that there was someone on the inside working against them. It felt like he was losing control of everything he had worked so hard to build. His phone buzzed once again, the notification reading, "New message from Sophie." David opened it quickly. "It's Ryan, we've got him." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. He had hoped it wouldn't be him, but deep down, he knew they were getting close to the truth. Ryan had been acting strangely ever since he joined the dealership, and now the pieces of the puzzle were starting to fall into place. David stood up from his desk, pacing around the room. His first instinct was to confront Ryan immediately, but he knew he couldn't afford to make a rash move, not when there was so much at stake. He needed a plan. Sophie and Hailey sat across from each other in the break room, watching Ryan from a distance. He was nervously talking to one of the senior salesmen, his movements twitchy, as if he were trying to hide something. Sophie could see it in his eyes. The guilt, the fear. "He knows we're onto him," Sophie muttered. "We need to do something before he makes a run for it." Hailey leaned forward, her expression serious. "We can't just confront him out in the open. He might have something bigger planned. If he's been working for Lang this long, he probably has connections we don't know about." Sophie nodded, glancing toward the door. "I'll talk to Dad. We need to move quickly." Back in his office, David's phone buzzed again. This time it was a call from Mark Winston. "David," Mark's voice crackled through the phone, "you're running out of time. Lang's pushing hard, and I'm not sure how long I can hold." "Her off." David's teeth ground together. "I don't need your threats, Winston. I'm dealing with my own problems." "Oh, I think you'll want my help sooner rather than later," Mark said with a chuckle. "You might have a traitor in your midst, and if that's the case, you'll need someone who knows how to handle it." David's jaw tightened. He was tired of Winston's games, tired of being backed into a corner. "I don't trust you, Mark. Don't try to act like you're on my side." "I'm just saying," Mark's voice lowered, "you'll want to. Have your allies lined up before the storm hits. Lang doesn't play fair." David hung up, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts. Mark was right, but that didn't mean he could trust him. He had to handle this himself. He had to protect his family, his business, and everything he had worked for. Later that afternoon, David gathered Sophie, Hailey, and his legal team in the conference room. His heart was heavy with the burden of, "The choice is ahead. We have to act now," he said, his voice steady despite the chaos swirling around him. "The mole is Ryan. Sophie and Hailey are sure of it." Sophie nodded, her voice calm but firm. "We've been watching him closely, and everything points to him. He's been in contact with Lang, and his behavior has been off. He's trying to cover his tracks, but it's too late." David looked at his legal team. "What's our next move? How do we take him down without making things worse?" One of his attorneys, a sharp-eyed woman named Caroline, spoke up. "We need to confront him, but carefully. We can't accuse him without hard evidence. If we push too hard, we risk him running or turning the tables on us." Hailey leaned forward, her expression resolute. "What if we confront him with an offer, something that makes him choose a side?" David thought for a moment, considering the options. "You're right, if we can get him to confess, we might be able to use him to our advantage." But as soon as the words left his mouth, he knew this was a dangerous game. Ryan was no fool. If he was working for Lang, he had his own agenda, and David didn't trust him for a second. That evening, the trap was set. Sophie and Hailey arranged for a private meeting with Ryan under the pretense of discussing some new sales initiatives. David stood in the shadows, his heart hammering in his chest. This was the moment that could decide everything. When Ryan walked into the break room, he seemed nervous, glancing at the door as if he were trying to escape. But Sophie and Hailey remained calm, smiling as they gestured for him to sit. "Ryan, we just wanted to talk," Sophie began, her voice casual but firm. "We've noticed some things and we think it's time you came clean." Ryan froze, his face draining of color. "What do you mean?" he stammered, his eyes darting around the room. Hailey leaned in. "We know about the contact with Lang Enterprises, the information you've been passing along. You're not as clever as you think." Ryan's expression shifted. For a moment, it looked like he was about to deny everything, but then, as if the weight of the situation hit him, he slumped in his chair. "I didn't want this. I never wanted to get involved. But I had no choice. She said she could help me, help my family. Lang had leverage. You have no idea what she can do." Sophie and Hailey exchanged a look, their suspicions confirmed. But David, standing outside the door, had heard enough. He stepped into the room, his voice cold. "Ryan, you've crossed a line. You're not just a pawn in this game anymore. You made a choice to betray us, and now you'll have to deal with the consequences." Ryan looked up at him, fear in his eyes. "Please, I didn't mean to hurt anyone. I was just trying to protect my family." David's anger flared, but he kept it under control. "Protect your family? You're putting all of ours at risk, and now you've put us in a position we can't come back from." Sophie stepped forward, her voice soft but final. "You've made your choices, Ryan, and now we have to make ours." As the confrontation ended, David couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. Lang had a mole inside his company, but now they had one more problem to deal with. How far would Lang go to destroy them? David's phone buzzed once again, a message from Caroline, his lawyer. "Lang has filed an emergency motion for a restraining order. She's not backing down. You need to prepare for the worst." David's blood ran cold. It was happening. Everything was falling apart, and there was no way to stop it now. The days that followed the confrontation with Ryan felt like an eternity. David couldn't shake the weight of the decisions that lay ahead. Victoria Lang was relentless, and now, with a mole exposed within his ranks, David had only one choice: fight back with everything he had, or lose everything. Sitting in his office, David stared at the documents in front of him. The legal team had been scrambling all week to counter Lang's latest move, a restraining order that was forcing David's dealership to shut down temporarily. The damage was already done. The dealership's reputation was in tatters and the press was having a field day. "Dad, are you okay?" Sophie's voice broke through his thoughts. She stood in the doorway, her expression concerned but determined. David didn't look up. "Do I look okay?" Sophie crossed the room and placed a hand on his shoulder. "You're not alone in this. We'll figure it out. We always do." David let out a breath, pushing the papers aside. "I'm not sure how much more I can take. Lang is closing in, and I don't know who to trust anymore. Even my own team has been compromised." Sophie sat down across from him. "I know this is tough, but we're not giving up. We can still beat her." David looked at his daughter, her face full of resolve. She was right. This wasn't the time to give in. He couldn't let Victoria Lang win, not when everything was on the line. But the stakes had never been higher. He was going to need a plan, a bold move to take back control. Later that day, David gathered his most trusted team in the conference room. Sophie, Hailey, Caroline, his lawyer, and a few key executives from the dealership stood around the table waiting for him to speak. David stood up and paced in front of them. His mind raced, but he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't fight this battle the same way he had before. It was time to play the game on his terms. "Lang's got us in a corner," David began, his voice steady. "We're losing ground. The restraining order, the lawsuits, the smear campaign. It's all part of her strategy to crush us, but we're not going to roll over. We're going to hit back." Caroline raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean exactly?" David stopped pacing and turned to face her. "We need to strike at Lang where it hurts. I've been thinking about it for days, and I've realized that we've been reacting to her moves instead of making our own." Sophie nodded. "You're saying we need to go on the offensive?" "That's exactly what I'm saying," David replied. "We're going to take the fight to her." The plan was risky, but David had no other choice. They would use Lang's own tactics against her. First, they would publicly expose the fact that she had been manipulating people in David's dealership, specifically Ryan, and that her company had a hand in orchestrating the entire smear campaign. Sophie and Hailey would work with Caroline to make sure the evidence was solid and that they had the legal leverage to back up their claims. But there was more. David had one final card to play: Mark Winston. Winston had been a thorn in David's side from the beginning, but he was also a powerful ally when it came to the right kind of leverage. He had a vast network, and if David could use Winston's resources against Lang, he could potentially turn the tide in his favor. David called Mark, his finger hovering over the phone as he contemplated what to say. The man was a wild card, but he needed Mark's influence desperately. After a few rings, Mark's familiar voice came through the speaker. "David, what can I do for you?" David took a deep breath. "I need your help. Lang's going after everything I've worked for, and right now I need to take her down, but I can't do it alone." Mark's laugh was sharp. "You should have asked me sooner. I knew this day would come, but what exactly do you need from me?" David exhaled slowly. "I need access to your network. I need to know everything about Lang's dealings, her finances, her connections. We're going to expose her for what she really is." Mark paused. "You're playing a dangerous game, David, but I like it. Consider it done. I'll send over everything I have on Lang." David's heart pounded in his chest as he hung up. This was it, the final gambit. The following days were a blur of action. David's team worked tirelessly, gathering evidence and preparing for their counterattack. Sophie and Hailey were in constant communication with Caroline, making sure every piece of the puzzle was in place. They had gathered emails, phone records, and even surveillance footage that clearly showed Lang's involvement in the dealership's troubles. With Winston's help, they had also uncovered a web of corrupt business deals that Lang had been involved in, deals that were not only illegal, but could potentially put her entire empire at risk. This was the ammunition David needed to take her down. It was the day before they were set to go public with everything. David sat in his office looking out at the dealership floor. The once thriving business now felt like a shell of its former self. But tomorrow, that would all change. He had no illusions that this would be easy. Lang was a formidable adversary, and there would be consequences. But David was prepared to lose everything if it meant bringing her down. He couldn't allow her to destroy everything his family had built. The clock was ticking. He was about to make a decision that could either save them or ruin them. Sophie entered the office, her face set with determination. "We're ready. We've got everything we need," David turned to her. "I've been thinking about this for a long time, and no matter what happens, I need you to know one thing." Sophie raised an eyebrow. "What's that?" David met her eyes, his voice steady. "This fight, it's not just about the dealership. It's about protecting our family. We'll do whatever it takes." Sophie nodded. "We'll win, Dad." "We have to." David stood up, his hand resting on the desk. He felt the weight of the decision on his shoulders, but in that moment, he knew it was the right one. Tomorrow, they would take their stand. Tomorrow, the battle would begin. The air was thick with anticipation. As David stood in front of the press conference room, Sophie, Hailey, and his legal team beside him. The time had come. The final pieces of the puzzle were in place, and the key moment of truth had arrived. Tomorrow was D-Day. The day they would expose Victoria Lang's empire for the fraud it truly was, but there was no turning back now. David's hand tightened around the podium as he looked out at the sea of journalists gathered in front of him. The media had been relentless in its coverage of the dealership's struggles, but David knew that today he would finally get to turn the tables. This wasn't just about clearing his name, it was about bringing justice. Sophie leaned in and whispered, "You're ready for this, Dad. We've got everything we need." David nodded, forcing a calm smile onto his face. "I've been ready for a long time." The conference was scheduled for later that afternoon, and everything had to be perfect. The lawyers had briefed him on the talking points, and the evidence they'd gathered, emails, phone records, even wiretaps, was damning. If Lang had any chance of getting out of this unscathed, it was slim to none. But the weight of what was about to happen still sat heavily on David's chest. Exposing Lang's corruption would certainly destroy her, but it could also have serious repercussions on his family and the business. Would it all be worth it? That evening, David sat in his office, going over the final details. The world outside. The dealership windows had grown dark, and the only sounds were the ticking of the clock and the occasional hum of traffic. Suddenly his phone buzzed, an encrypted message from Mark Winston. "It's time. The board meeting is in an hour. Lang will be there. Do what you need to do." David's heart skipped a beat. This was it. Mark was giving him the green light. The final stage was set. He stood up, smoothing out his suit, and turned to Sophie. "Get ready, it's showtime." The press conference room was filled with anticipation. Cameras flashed as reporters jockeyed for position, eager to get the first scoop on the showdown between David and Victoria Lang. This was the moment that could change everything for both of them. David took his place at the podium, his eyes scanning the crowd. Sophie and Hailey stood off to the side, their faces a mix of nerves and determination. Caroline, the lawyer, was sitting at the back, ready to provide legal support if things got complicated. David cleared his throat and began speaking, his voice steady despite the weight of the moment. "Good afternoon, everyone. I want to thank you for being here today. This has been a trying time for my family, my business, and everyone who's supported us over the years. We've been the target of a smear campaign, false accusations, and personal attacks, but today we're here to set the record straight." He paused for a moment, making eye contact with the reporters in the front row. "The truth is, Victoria Lang has been behind all of this. She's been using her power and influence to destroy us, and today we're exposing everything." A collective murmur swept through the crowd as David clicked a button on the remote, and a large screen behind him lit up with images of incriminating documents, emails, phone records, bank statements, every piece of evidence that would reveal Lang's true nature. "The evidence is clear," David continued, his voice growing firmer. "Lang has been orchestrating a campaign to not only take down our business, but also to manipulate key members of my team for her own benefit. We've gathered this evidence through months of investigation, and we're not backing down." The reporters erupted with questions, their voices clamoring for more details. But David wasn't done. "Not only that," he added, "but we've uncovered a trail of corruption that goes all the way to Lang's business dealings. Her empire isn't built on integrity, it's built on lies and deceit." The room fell, silent. For the first time, David could feel the shift in the room. He had them. They were listening. But just as he thought he had control of the situation, a voice from the back called out, "Mr. Carrington, do you have any proof that Lang has personally benefited from these illegal activities? Or is this all speculation?" David turned to see a reporter from a major news outlet, her expression challenging. He knew this would be the moment that determined how well this would all unfold. He clicked the remote again, and another set of images flashed on the screen, documents showing Lang's involvement in laundering money, connections to illicit businesses and wire transfers linking her to shady deals that went beyond just his dealership. "We have everything we need," David said firmly. "These are the facts. These are the hard truths that Lang has tried to hide for years, and now there's no place for her to run." At that moment, the doors to the press conference room opened, and in walked a familiar figure, Victoria Lang. She stood at the door for a moment, her sharp eyes scanning the room. The tension in the room thickened, and everyone fell silent as she stepped forward, her heels clicking on the marble floor. David felt a chill run down his spine. This was it, the face-to-face showdown. Lang didn't say a word at first. She simply stared at David with a cold, calculated look. Then finally she spoke. "You think you've won, David?" Her voice was dripping with venom. "You have no idea what you're up against. I've already won. You're just too blind to see it." David's jaw clenched. "No, Lang. This time, you're the one who's going down." With a swift motion, he pressed another button on the remote, and the final piece of evidence flashed on the screen. A recording of a phone call between Lang and Ryan, the mole. It was a confession, clear as day. Lang was directly involved in the plot to sabotage David's dealership. The room erupted into chaos as reporters scrambled to get the first word on the story, but Lang wasn't finished yet. "You think this changes anything?" she sneered. You think a few documents and a recording will make me disappear? I built an empire, David. You can't destroy it with a press conference. David stepped forward, his eyes locked on hers. No, but I can expose it, and that's exactly what I'm going to do. As the media buzzed with questions and confusion, David turned to Sophie and Hailey. They had done it. Lang's empire was crumbling, and it wasn't just because of the evidence. It was because David had finally found his voice. But as the press conference came to an end, David couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. Lang might have been exposed, but there was still the question of what would come next. Would she go down quietly? Or would she fight back with everything she had left? One thing was certain, David had just set the stage for the final battle. And this time, he wasn't going to lose. The world had shifted. David could feel it in the air. The walls of the dealership that once felt like a sanctuary now seemed fragile, like the very foundation of everything he had worked for was teetering, on the edge. The press conference had sent shockwaves through the business world, but David knew better than anyone that this wasn't over, not by a long shot. Victoria Lang wasn't the type to go down without a fight. He could already see the battle lines. Being drawn, she was preparing her own counterattack. The question was, would his family, his business, and everything he had built be able to withstand the storm that was coming? The next day, David stood by the window in his office, staring out at the dealership. The once bustling lot was now eerily quiet. Cars were still lined up, waiting for the few remaining customers who hadn't yet abandoned them, but there was an undeniable sense of foreboding. The press was relentless. The rumors about Lang's empire being built on corruption were spreading like wildfire, and yet Lang hadn't made any public statements. Her silence was deafening. David knew she was planning something. Dangerous, Sophie, Hailey, he called out, turning to face them. They were in the office reviewing paperwork as usual, but David could see the exhaustion in their eyes. We need to prepare for her next move. She won't let this go. She's too powerful to just disappear. Sophie set down the file she was reading and looked at him with a mixture of concern and determination. We've got everything we need, Dad. We've exposed her. There's no way she can get out of this without facing consequences. David hesitated, his gaze shifting back to the dealership floor. Maybe, but I don't think Lang will go down quietly. She'll come after us in ways we haven't even considered yet. We have to stay ahead of her. Just then, David's phone buzzed. It was a message from Caroline, his lawyer. Urgent. Lang is filing a counterclaim. She's going after the dealership and accusing you of fraud and defamation. Be ready for the legal battle of your life. David's heart sank. This was what he had feared. Lang was going to fight back, and she had the resources to make it a long and costly battle. He stood up and grabbed his jacket. Get ready. We're going to need every lawyer, every piece of evidence, and every ally. We have to take her down once and for all. As the hours passed, the pressure continued to mount. The legal teams worked tirelessly, reviewing every angle of Lang's counterclaim. David's own defense was strong. His team had evidence of Lang's corruption, and her involvement in illegal activities was undeniable. But Lang wasn't going to give up her empire without a fight. She had hired the best legal minds in the country to come after him, and she was ruthless. David and Sophie spent hours going over the strategy for the upcoming court battle. They needed to stay sharp, focused, and most importantly, ready for anything Lang might throw at them. As the day turned into night, there was a knock at the door. David opened it to find Caroline standing there, holding a stack of legal documents. David, she said, her tone grave. It's worse than we thought. Lang has brought in some heavy hitters. She's not just going after your dealership, she's after your reputation, your legacy. She's targeting everything. David felt a knot tighten in his chest. This was the moment of truth. Lang had thrown everything she had at him. The question now was, could they survive it? We're not backing down, David said firmly, looking at Sophie and Hailey. We'll fight her with everything we've got. The court battle began a week later. The courtroom was packed with reporters, legal experts and onlookers who were eager to see how the case would unfold. David sat at the front, his nerves steely, but inside, his mind raced. This was the final fight. If they won, Lang would be exposed for the fraud she was. But if they lost everything, his dealership, his family's reputation, everything could come crashing down. Victoria Lang sat across the room, her face expressionless, her legal team surrounding her. David couldn't help but feel the weight of the situation. This was no longer just about business. It was about survival. The trial was brutal. Lang's lawyers came out swinging, attacking David's character and trying to discredit every piece of evidence. They accused David of trying to sabotage Lang's business for personal gain, and they twisted the facts in every possible way. For every document David presented, Lang's team had a counter-argument, a way to make it seem like they didn't matter. But David didn't flinch. He had one thing Lang didn't: the truth. Every time her team tried to twist the facts, David's legal team would find a way to expose the lie, to turn the tide in their favor. The pressure was enormous, but David stayed calm, staying one step ahead. Finally, after days of back-and-forth arguments, it was time for the closing statements. David stood up, his voice steady and unwavering. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, for the past few weeks you've heard the accusations. You've heard the lies, the manipulation, and the deceit, but you've also heard the truth. You've seen the evidence. Victoria Lang has built her empire on lies, on illegal activities, on taking advantage of others. And I stand before you today not just as the owner of a dealership, but as a man who fought for what's right. We have exposed her for what she truly is." He paused for a moment, letting the words sink in. "This isn't just about business, it's about doing what's right. It's about fighting for the people who have supported us. It's about standing up to corruption no matter the cost." David sat down, his heart pounding in his chest. The silence in the room was deafening. He could feel the weight of every eye on him, the scrutiny, the tension. Now it was up to the jury. The next day the jury returned with a verdict: guilty. The word echoed through the courtroom like a thunderclap. David's heart skipped a beat as the reality of the moment set in. Victoria Lang had been found guilty of fraud, corruption, and multiple illegal activities. Her empire was crumbling. The charges against her were severe, and the damage to her reputation was irreparable. David could hardly believe it. After everything they had been through, after all the sacrifices, they had won. Victoria Lang's reign of terror was over. Weeks passed, and the dust began to settle. David's dealership slowly regained its footing. The media buzzed with stories about Lang's fall from grace, and her assets were being seized as the legal battles continued. David sat in his office, looking out at the dealership floor once again. This time, it was different. The air felt lighter. His family was safe. His business was intact. They had fought a battle that many would have lost, but they had won. Sophie walked in, a smile on her face. "We did it, Dad. We actually did it." David smiled back, a sense of relief washing over him. "Yes, we did. And it wasn't just about winning the battle. It was about staying true to who we are, no matter what." As the sun set over the dealership, David knew that they had emerged from the darkness stronger than ever before. Their fight wasn't just for the dealership, it was for their family, for their future. And now they could finally begin to rebuild.